She could kill you. The drill instructor said it loudly enough for everyone to hear and quietly enough to mean it as a threat. The gravel yard fell silent as his hand closed around the recruit's collar, pulling her forward, until her boots scraped a thin white line in the dust. Recruits froze mid-breath. Someone dropped a canteen. The instructor's shadow swallowed her whole. And in that moment, the entire platoon understood that this wasn't discipline anymore. It was something else. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Her name was Mara Hayes, 23, first-generation college graduate, volunteer EMT back home. She had signed up because she believed structure could save people the way chaos had once nearly broken her family. She stood there now, jaw tight, eyes forward, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. Nothing. No flinch, no excuse, no apology. She didn't know. The drill instructor leaned closer. His voice dropped. "You think you're dangerous," he said. "You think you're special." He laughed, sharp and brief. "She could kill you," he added, nodding at her like she was a weapon he owned. The words moved through the yard like a chill. Mara felt the air change, felt the weight of eyes on her back. She tasted iron and dust. She wondered, briefly, whether staying silent was courage or fear dressed up as obedience. He shoved her away, not enough to knock her down, enough to remind her who held power. The official line later would call it a correction. The truth was simpler. It was assault. What no one in the yard knew, what the instructor couldn't know, was that 4 men were watching from the far edge of the base, standing near an unmarked sedan beneath a fluttering flag. They wore no insignia that day, no rank on their collars, just quiet posture and eyes that missed nothing. All 4 had spent their lives in rooms where decisions ended wars quietly. All 4 had earned their authority the hard way through water and fire, and the weight of other people's lives. All 4 had come for a reason that had nothing to do with Mara. They were there for oversight, for standards, for truth. The instructor barked an order. The platoon snapped back into motion, boots grinding rhythm into the yard. Mara returned to formation. Her hands shook once, then stilled. She focused on breathing, on not thinking about the way his fingers had dug in, on the rules she had learned early in life. Survive now, process later. But later came faster than she expected. A senior petty officer crossed the yard with measured steps and spoke quietly to the instructor. The man stiffened. His eyes flicked once toward the flag, then back to the recruits. He nodded, clipped and annoyed, and barked. Another order to keep moving. Mara felt it before she understood it. That subtle shift. The way authority can drain from a voice when it realizes it's being watched. She thought she'd never see him again. She was wrong. An hour later, she was called out of training. No explanation, no reprimand, just her name, spoken once, and a direction. Recruits murmured behind their hands as she jogged across the base, past administrative buildings that smelled like paper and polish, into a room that felt colder than the yard, for chairs, for men, coffee untouched, the hum of an air vent, dust motes drifting like they didn't know what was about to happen. They introduced themselves without flourish. Former operators, joint command backgrounds, retired at ranks that carried weight in rooms where no one raised their voice. Each had worn the trident at some point. Each had commanded others in war. Each had learned, the hard way, what power does when it's left unchecked. Mara stood at attention. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. "Tell us exactly what happened," one of them said. Not unkindly, not gently, simply true. She hesitated. This was the moment of moral tension, the one no manual prepares you for. Speak, and risk being labeled difficult. Stay silent, and become complicit in your own erasure. She spoke. She described the words, the grip, the shove, the way it felt like being reduced to a lesson instead of a human being. She did not embellish. She did not cry. Her voice shook anyway. The men listened. One took notes. One stared at a blank wall as if replaying something old and familiar. Another nodded once. Almost imperceptibly, outside, word spread. Recruits whispered. Instructors paced. Doors closed softly, then didn't open again. The drill instructor was called in next. He walked with confidence born of years without consequence. He explained. He justified. He smiled once, thin and practiced. He spoke about pressure and standards and the need to break people down. The room stayed quiet. Then one of the men leaned forward. "You confused fear with respect," he said, "and control with leadership." Another followed. Voice calm as still water. "You used your authority to elevate yourself. That's not training. That's abuse." The third slid a folder across the table. Dates, witness statements, patterns. This was not an isolated moment. It never is. The fourth spoke last. "Your career ends today." There was no shouting, no drama, just a signature, a phone call, and a silence that felt heavier than any reprimand. The instructor's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, closed it, stood, and for the first time in years, left a room without command. Minutes later, the yard filled with movement. Officers appeared where there had been none. Neighbors beyond the fence paused mid-step, sensing the shift. Recruits watched from formation as a man who once towered over them walked past without meeting their eyes. It happened fast, and yet it had been building for a long time. Mara returned to training that afternoon. Same boots, same dust, same sun. But something fundamental had changed. The air felt cleaner, the commands sharper, not louder. Authority restored to its proper place. That night, she sat on her bunk, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, and felt the tremor she'd been holding back finally release. She thought about the line he'd thrown at her like a weapon. "She could kill you," and she understood. Now, how wrong he'd been. Real strength wasn't about fear. It was about restraint, about knowing when to stop, about protecting the people. You lead even when no one is watching. Weeks passed. The story didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. It traveled the way truth often does, quietly, through glances and posture, and the way instructors corrected without cruelty. Recruits trained harder, not because they were afraid, but because they were respected. On graduation day, Mara spotted for familiar silhouettes at the edge of the crowd. They didn't wave. They didn't step forward. They didn't need credit. They watched her march past, eyes forward, shoulders squared, and nodded once. She never learned all their names. She didn't need to. What stayed with her was the lesson they embodied, that justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in plain clothes. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it ends a career in minutes to protect a future that hasn't happened yet. Because power, when it's real, protects down the chain, not up. And the echo of that first moment returned to her, transformed, not as a threat, as a reminder. Because cruelty is loud, but accountability is decisive. And the yard that once held its breath learned how to exhale again. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from and what leadership means to you. Subscribe for more stories about courage, accountability, and the quiet moments that change everything.